It started with a garden gnome. I'd placed it near the edge of my backyard, a little ceramic guy holding a lantern, standing guard over the hydrangeas my mother once planted. But one morning, it wasn't there. Not broken, not missing, just sitting further in, almost a meter inward. At first, I thought maybe the wind had pushed it. Ridiculous. I know. But the thought bothered me. The entire garden felt smaller. Something was off. That evening, I pulled out the original survey of my property. I'd kept it filed with old documents in the guest bedroom closet, just in case. The numbers were clear. The rear boundary extended 6 meters from the patio. I grabbed a tape measure and walked it out. 5 meters. 1 full meter missing. The next day, I checked the county's online records out of curiosity. That's when I nearly dropped my coffee. The updated parcel map showed my backyard line, drawn a full 3 feet inward compared to the document I had. Not just mine either. My neighbor Lydia's yard had shrunk too. And Derek's. A string of at least 20 houses along the eastern side of the neighborhood all had property lines that had been altered. But here's what chilled me. The updated maps were dated just 3 months ago. No notices, no meetings, no HOA announcement, just a quiet little shift in ink on a government map, and suddenly, part of my land was no longer mine. That night, I went outside and stood by the garden bed, phone in hand, rechecking measurements. The gnome was back in its old place, for now, but it no longer stood on land I could prove was mine. And somewhere, someone had a reason to make that happen. I wasn't the kind of person who rushed to conclusions, but something about this felt deliberate. The next morning, I went straight to the HOA office, a dull brick building tucked behind the community center, where complaints went to die. Karen Mitchell, the board president, was behind the front desk, flipping through some color-printed landscaping brochures like she didn't have a care in the world. I cleared my throat. Karen, do you know anything about the new boundary maps uploaded to the county GIS system? She didn't look up. Boundary maps are handled by the county, Eleanor, not us, right? But they don't just redraw them without a petition. And the petition usually starts with the HOA. That made her pause. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she adjusted her reading glasses before glancing up. Your property hasn't changed, Eleanor. I raised my phone, already open to the satellite image, with the old and new lines overlapped. It has, by exactly 2.6 feet on the west side and nearly 4.5 feet in the rear. That's 80 square meters in total. My garden, my fence, and half my stone path are no longer inside the legal boundaries. Karen offered the kind of smile you reserve for toddlers who think they've found buried treasure in a sandbox. Boundary discrepancies happen. The county corrects old errors all the time. I didn't respond. I just held her gaze, long enough to make her blink. I'll be requesting the HOA's record of petitions filed over the last 6 months. I said calmly. Under the bylaws, I have the right to review them within 7 days. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands. If that's how you'd like to spend your time, Eleanor, feel free. But I assure you, nothing improper has occurred. It was the kind of sentence people only use when something very improper has definitely occurred. Later that day, I spoke to Lydia next door. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she told me she noticed her shed now technically sat on common space, according to the new parcel map. And 2 weeks ago, Derek from across the street received a letter warning him about unauthorized encroachment on what used to be his backyard. That wasn't a coincidence. That was strategy. Someone or some group had quietly redrawn boundaries to shrink private lots, and then planned to use that common space for what? New structures? Easements? Sale to developers? I didn't have proof. Yet. But I had a map. I had neighbors. And I had a sickening feeling that Karen wasn't the only one who knew exactly what was going on. What they hadn't counted on was that I kept everything. Original documents, land surveys, letters from the previous owner, even a faded blueprint from 2003 signed and notarized. The one my ex-husband had insisted we file with a public notary when we first bought the house. They could move lines on a digital map, but they couldn't erase paper. I've never thought of myself as paranoid. Cautious, maybe. Meticulous, definitely. But when someone starts shifting your property lines behind your back, it awakens a part of you that's hard to switch off. That week, I barely slept. I spent my evenings poring over public records and satellite maps, like I was preparing for a bar exam in urban planning. I started with my own survey, of course, the one from 2003, certified and stamped, back when my ex-husband insisted on over-preparing everything. At the time, I thought it was overkill. Now, it was gold. It matched the property boundaries I'd known for 20 years, down to the centimeter. I dug out our original closing documents too, the title insurance file, the site plan, even the neighbor's signed agreement when we rebuilt the fence. Every single record confirmed the same perimeter. Then, I turned my attention outward. The county's GIS system had quietly updated its parcel boundaries 3 months ago. Most people wouldn't have noticed. The changes were subtle, in some cases, barely a foot. But when I overlaid the current maps against older ones using a basic mapping tool, the pattern became painfully clear. It wasn't random. The same side of each house, the same orientation, always retreating inward from the shared boundary with the undeveloped lots behind our block. Land I had always assumed belonged to the HOA. But now, that buffer zone was getting wider. By taking a slice from each private backyard, 20 properties affected, possibly more. The math was simple. If each house gave up just 2 to 4 feet across the back, that was a full strip of land running the length of the neighborhood, enough space to install a small utility road, a gated access lane, or, as I would soon learn, a private drive for 6 new luxury townhomes being proposed for development. I found the project buried in a planning commission agenda from 2 months prior. It was listed innocuously under the name Phase 3 Access Corridor Approval, Pine Estates Expansion. It didn't mention our street by name, just a vague line about adjusted boundary approvals filed through HOA Council. My stomach flipped. That's when I knew this wasn't incompetence. This was coordinated. Karen hadn't just manipulated HOA authority. She had submitted materials, likely falsified or misleading, to county officials, requesting boundary revisions without informing residents. That allowed her to offer up a neat slice of common buffer space to developers, when in reality, that land had been taken from us. The next day, I printed everything: maps, surveys, parcel numbers, timestamps, planning commission minutes. I organized it all into a binder, complete with tabs. It was time to talk to the others. I started with Lydia. She looked at the maps in disbelief, then reached for her husband's survey from when they bought the house in 2008. Sure enough, the line had shifted. Derek was next. He just received a notice about property noncompliance from the HOA regarding his shed, a shed that had stood untouched for years. He thought it was a mistake. Now, he wasn't so sure. Over the next 48 hours, I met with 8 neighbors. 6 had similar stories: minor citations from the HOA for encroachments, unauthorized structures or maintenance violations along rear property lines. Only now did they make sense. But here's what truly turned the tide. One of them, Marcus, had documentation from a fence installation 5 years ago. The contractor had filed the fence permit with the county, complete with boundary confirmation. That permit directly contradicted the new map. It proved, without ambiguity, that the parcel lines were altered after construction. I took copies of everything and emailed a quiet request to a friend of mine, James, a retired civil engineer who'd worked in land development. He owed me a favor. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. 2 days later, we met at a cafe outside the HOA's jurisdiction. James showed up with a ruler, a printed stack of satellite overlays, and a look that said he wasn't here for brunch. "This was done on purpose," he said, flipping through the pages. "You see this? These lines don't shift unless someone submits a boundary adjustment with supporting documents. usually signed by affected property owners. I blinked. We never signed anything. He nodded. Exactly. Which means someone either fabricated authorization or exploited a loophole. He leaned forward. The most likely scenario? The HOA filed a blanket easement under a general maintenance clause. It's shady, but if the county clerk didn't double-check ownership verification, it could have slipped through. I felt the weight of that statement settle into my chest. So it's real. They took our land on paper. James sighed. Not permanently, but undoing it will be hard and noisy. Good. I was ready to make noise. That evening, I drafted a letter, not to the HOA, to every resident affected by the boundary change. I included maps, dates, side-by-side property overlays, and an invitation to meet at my home the following Sunday. I hand-delivered 12 envelopes. The rest I emailed. The following weekend, my living room overflowed with folding chairs. Neighbors leaned on counters, sat on stairs, held cups of weak coffee and packets of documents. No one yelled, no one panicked, but the collective realization that we'd all been quietly robbed settled over the room like a slow-moving storm. By the time the meeting ended, we had formed a plan. We would file a joint complaint with the county assessor's office. We would request an immediate audit of all boundary changes filed by the HOA over the last year, and we would retain a land use attorney together. As the others left that evening, Lydia touched my arm. You started this, she said. You caught it. I shook my head. No. A garden gnome caught it. I just paid attention. Outside, the breeze rustled the hedges where my backyard used to extend a little further. For now, the lines were still wrong. But I was done being quiet. Some people underestimate the power of neighbors, especially when they assume most of us are too distracted, too polite, or too tired to fight back. But something changes when you realize your property's been stolen, not with a bulldozer or a wrecking crew, but with a printer and a digital boundary line. In the weeks that followed our meeting, the neighborhood began to shift in a way Karen Mitchell had not anticipated. The usual silos, retirees who kept to themselves, young couples just trying to stay afloat, the busy single parents. They were all now showing up to each other's porches, comparing documents, forwarding emails, whispering rumors that no longer seemed like paranoia. We weren't angry. Not yet. We were methodical. And that's much harder to stop. The first order of business was hiring an attorney. James recommended a land use specialist named Carla Mehta, a precise woman in her early 40s with the kind of calm, relentless energy that made you feel she already knew what the outcome would be. She took one look at our binder, surveys, overlays, notarized documents, and nodded. This isn't a civil disagreement, she said, flipping through satellite comparisons. This is fraud by omission, and possibly more. We officially retained her as our counsel, each household pitching in toward the retainer. Not everyone could afford it easily, but we made it work. We were investing not just in land, but in truth. The first letter Carla sent was to the county assessor's office, requesting a halt on all processing of boundary data related to our subdivision. The second was to the Planning Commission, asking for the immediate suspension of the Pine Estates expansion project, pending review of property ownership. And the third, the one that felt personal, was addressed to the Lakeside Community HOA. Karen didn't respond. Instead, that week, several of us received letters accusing us of spreading misinformation and inciting unnecessary unrest within the community. Marcus got a $750 fine for unauthorized pruning of shared vegetation. He had trimmed a bush on the strip that used to be part of his yard. Lydia received a warning about inappropriate signage for a small poster she'd taped inside her front window. Don't let HOA erase our property. I got a hand-delivered envelope taped to my door. It accused me of ongoing disruption of community harmony and threatened legal escalation if I continued defamatory actions. It was unsigned, no board name, no contact. Just a watermark of the HOA's logo and a vague threat. I placed it on my kitchen table and kept going. Carla advised us to remain public, but not loud. We weren't to shout at meetings, deface anything, or stage protests. Don't give them leverage, she warned. Stay clean. Let the paper trail talk. So we did. We started hosting document days, Sundays, in my garage. Neighbors brought whatever they had, home purchase packets, appraisal documents, insurance diagrams, contractor reports, even aerial photos printed from real estate listings. One man had a Christmas card photo from 10 years ago that, inadvertently, showed a clear shot of his old fence line, now 2 feet into the common area. Every detail helped. The more we gathered, the worse the story got. Not only had Karen's board submitted the easement redefinition quietly, they had bundled it with an unrelated maintenance request, buried 6 pages deep in a 28-page attachment, labeled Drainage Optimization and Lot Alignment Update. According to Carla, it was a deliberate tactic. They hadn't forged signatures. They had sidestepped them entirely by calling the boundary changes necessary corrections for community infrastructure. But they had signed something, a sworn statement that no affected homeowners had objected. That document, Carla noted, was enough to initiate a fraud investigation. Meanwhile, whispers about the new townhomes began surfacing. A realtor friend of mine sent me a brochure, mock-ups of 6 sleek, modern houses with rooftop decks, exclusive lake access, and a private lane that, surprise, surprise, traced the exact path of our stolen boundary strips. And the kicker? The listings bragged about low HOA restrictions due to private road easements secured in advance. They weren't just building next to us. They were building on us. So we brought our findings to the local news. We didn't shout. We didn't throw stones. We sent a quiet, professional press release with attachments. We offered interviews. The local station ran the story under the headline, Homeowners Claim HOA Shrunk Lots to Make Way for Luxury Project. County Opens Investigation. It aired on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday, Karen had called an emergency HOA board meeting. She opened it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, thanking the community for ongoing engagement and healthy discourse. She referred to our findings as misinterpretations, claimed that no land was technically taken, and blamed misaligned expectations around what constituted personal versus shared property. I stood up. My expectations are that when I buy land and I pay taxes on it, that it remains mine, not quietly reassigned to developers. So someone's nephew can market lakefront access. There was a murmur. People nodded. Karen's smile froze in place. Then something unexpected happened. Miss S. Foster, an 82-year-old widow who hadn't attended a meeting in 2 years, slowly raised her hand. She pulled out a notebook. In a steady voice, she began reading aloud the minutes she had recorded at each HOA meeting for the past decade. None of them mentioned a vote on boundary changes. Not once. Then she said something that stunned the room. 2 years ago, I overheard Karen on a phone call in the community center hallway. She said the words, "We can shift the maps. People won't notice." I wrote it down. Silence. Karen tried to laugh it off. That's ridiculous. But the damage was done. The room wasn't with her anymore. By Friday, the county assessor's office had suspended all transactions related to our subdivision. The Planning Commission put the Pine Estates project under review. A county investigator reached out to Carla. Karen hadn't responded to any formal questions. 2 board members resigned. One of them called me privately to apologize. I didn't know they were manipulating parcels, he said. She told us it was drainage optimization. Of course she did. By Saturday, the HOA issued a new letter, not a threat, a call for a vote. They wanted to hold a special election to restructure the board and review all pending land decisions. It wasn't a confession, but it was the first time they blinked. The gnome in my garden stood where it always had. For now, it still wasn't legally mine, but the tide had shifted. And for the first time in months, I felt the ground under my feet again. The vote wasn't even close. 2 weeks after the emergency HOA meeting, Nearly 80% of our neighborhood turned out to cast ballots. We held the election in the community center with folding tables, clipboards, and a volunteer from the county recorder's office overseeing the process, just to make sure no one accidentally misplaced the results this time. Karen Mitchell was officially removed as HOA president. So were 3 of her loyalists. One resigned before the ballots were even counted. We didn't cheer. There was no celebration. The mood wasn't triumphant. It was exhausted. Like a fever had broken. Replacing them were a handful of people who never thought they'd serve. Marcus, who once swore he'd never touch HOA politics. Lydia, who taught part-time at the local college. And Miss S. Foster, who, after years of meticulous note-taking, now held a title she deserved, Secretary of Records. Within a week, the new board released a public statement. The previous administration's actions regarding property boundary redefinitions are under formal review. All pending developments, easement adjustments, and land transfers are hereby frozen. Residents will be notified individually to confirm original property lines. It was the first honest communication we'd received in years. Meanwhile, Carla, our attorney, had submitted a formal complaint to the district attorney's office outlining a clear timeline of events, the remapping of private parcels, the submission of false statements to the Planning Commission, and the likely collusion between HOA leadership and the developer behind Pine Estates expansion. The county followed suit. An internal audit was opened at the assessor's office. Several employees were interviewed. One, anonymously, admitted that sign-off was expedited after pressure from a private consultant hired by the HOA. Guess who that consultant was? Karen's cousin, under a different name. I'll never forget the moment I opened the mailbox and saw the envelope from the County Land Records Division. Inside, a letter confirming that my original property boundaries had been reinstated and that all GIS maps would be reverted pending court review. 80 square meters. It was more than just space. It was truth, validation, a restoration of something deeper than land. But it didn't end there. 2 months later, the County Civil Fraud Division issued subpoenas. Karen was photographed leaving her home with 2 plainclothes investigators. Her Mercedes was impounded that afternoon. The developers behind Pine Estates withdrew their proposal entirely, citing community pushback. They would later claim no knowledge of the boundary changes, a defense that didn't hold up once the paper trail surfaced. Turns out, the proposal renderings showing the private lane had been submitted before the map changes were even made. Fraud. Intentional. Coordinated. The civil case is still ongoing, but several things have already happened. Karen lost her board seat, her developer contract, and her standing in the community. One of the former board members turned whistleblower and offered to testify in exchange for immunity. Carla says the most likely outcome is a settlement involving financial restitution and possibly criminal charges, depending on how far the county wants to go. But that wasn't what stuck with me. What stayed was the image of my neighbors, people who barely spoke to each other before, now greeting one another by name, sharing coffee, swapping old photos to help others confirm their lot lines, planting shared vegetables in the once-forgotten corner lot we reclaimed from the utility space Karen had fenced off. The irony? That land, the one meant for a developer's access lane, is now our community garden, officially voted into the bylaws. And the gnome? He's back, standing watch over my hydrangeas. On my land, where he's always belonged. A few weeks ago, I found a note in my mailbox. No signature. Just a torn scrap of yellow stationery, with one sentence written in all caps block letters. Y-O-U-R-E lucky this time, but watch what you dig up next. I read it twice. Then I placed it in a Ziploc bag and gave it to Carla, because the truth is, I don't scare easily anymore. Karen thought we'd be too scattered to fight back, too passive to notice. She thought she could redraw our world in silence. But we noticed, we remembered, and when it mattered most, we didn't stand alone.